Ναι, ωραία. Καλησπέρα σας. Αγαπητές φίλες, αγαπητοί φίλοι, είναι μεγάλη μου χαρά που σας καλωσορίζω όλες και όλους, την κάθε μία και τον καθένα από εσάς απόψε, στο Αρχαιολογικό Μουσείο Ηρακλείου. Σήμερα είναι η 14η διάλεξή μας, στον κύκλο διαλέξεων που διοργανώνουμε παράλληλα με την περιοδική έκθεση ΕΚΑΤΟΜΠΟΛΙΣ, ο Κόσμος της Αρχαϊκής Κρήτης. Η Γενική Διευθύντρια του Μουσείου, η κυρία Στέλλα Χρυσουλάκη, δεν είναι απόψε μαζί μας, επομένως έχω την ιδιαίτερη χαρά και τιμή να σας παρουσιάσω τον απόψινό μας ομιλητή. Σήμερα είναι μαζί μας ο καθηγητής Brice Erickson. Ο Brice Erickson είναι καθηγητής Κλασικών Σπουδών στο Πανεπιστήμιο της Καλιφόρνιας, στην Σάντα Μπάρμπαρα, και είναι ειδικευμένος στην αρχαϊκή και κλασική κεραμική του αρχαίου ελληνικού κόσμου. Ο καθηγητής Erickson έχει ασχοληθεί με ένα από τα πιο ενιγματικά ζητήματα της αρχαιολογίας της Κρήτης. Για δεκαετίες η έρευνα θεωρούσε ότι η Κρήτη κατά τον 6ο και 5ο αιώνα ήταν σε μια κατάσταση περιθωριοποίησης και ακινησίας. Μάλιστα αυτή η κατάσταση είχε πάρει μια ονομασία στη βιβλιογραφία. Λεγόταν το αρχαϊκό κενό της Κρήτης ή η αρχαϊκή σιωπή. Ο σημερινός ομιλητής μας, ο καθηγητής Erickson, είναι ένας από τους αρχαιολόγους που συνέβαλε αποφασιστικά στο να πληρωθεί, να γεμίσει αυτό το κενό, να σπάσει η σιωπή και να φανεί ότι πίσω από αυτή την ενιγματική σιωπή υπήρχαν ζωντανές πόλεις, θεσμικά οργανωμένες, οι οποίες με δυναμικό και στρατηγικό τρόπο προσαρμόζονταν στη νέα μεταβαλλόμενη συνθήκη της Ανατολικής Μεσογείου του 6ου και 5ου αιώνα π.Χ. Στο πρώτο του βιβλίο, το 2010, που ήταν ουσιαστικά η δημοσίευση της διδακτορικής του διατριβής, με τον υπέρτιτλο «Crete in Transition», η Κρήτη σε μετάβαση, κατάφερε με έναν τρόπο πρωτοποριακό να ανασυγκροτήσει την κεραμική της αρχαϊκής και κλασικής Κρήτης και όχι μόνο αυτό, αλλά τη νέα αυτή επισκόπηση της κεραμικής να την μετατρέψει σε μια νέα ιστορία για την Κρήτη του 6ου και 5ου αιώνα. Ακριβώς σε μελέτες σαν αυτή του καθηγητή Erickson στηριχτήκαμε για να δημιουργήσουμε ένα μουσιολογικό αφήγημα στην περιοδική μας έκθεση ΕΚΑΤΟΜΠΟΛΙΣ. Κυρίες και κύριοι, η ΕΚΑΤΟΜΠΟΛΙΣ παρουσιάζει μια νέα ιστορία της αρχαϊκής Κρήτης. Ο καθηγητής Erickson ήταν από τους πρώτους αρχαιολόγους που θεμελίωσαν αυτήν τη μετάβαση. Σας ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ που δεχτήκατε την πρόσκλησή μας και παρακαλώ να τον καλωσορίσουμε θερμά.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Well, I'm grateful for the invitation to speak to you today. My career as an archaeologist began on Crete with my work on my dissertation, which eventually became my first. Crete has played a role in everything I've done since. I sometimes think about the story of Kazantzakis, who carried a clod of Cretan earth with him wherever he went, and Crete has lodged itself in me. My topic today looks forward to my next book, a study of the Athenian Empire and its economic effects at places like Crete. Here is a preview of the main points I hope to make today. The primary argument will be that the Cretan economy became more complex in the 5th century as it concentrated on overseas trade. These economic advances also brought Crete into closer contact with Imperial Athens and its rival Persia. Crete had to perform a delicate balancing act as it reacted to these foreign powers. The 5th century was a transformative period for the Cretan economy. It also witnessed important social changes, the development of an austere, Spartan-like military order with little need for fancy possessions and elaborate display. This austerity, however, does not equal poverty. It came with the greater prosperity of the 5th century. Oops. To make my case, I will need to start with the ways earlier scholars have understood this period. We need to clear out some of the old baggage in the process. After the Bronze Age, the attention of scholars focused on the Orientalizing period, and for good reason. The Cretans then cultivated trade relations and other contacts with the advanced cultures of the Near East. This exchange of ideas produced substantial art on Crete, material of great interest, such as the shields from the Aegean cave. I can't remember where they are, housed in this museum. They're just in the room across. This was also a formative period for the development of state authority on the island. But then, sometime around 600 BC, things took a very different turn. Works of art, such as these bronze shields and elaborately decorated pottery, disappear. Crete enters what one prominent scholar has described as a period of silence. That's Nicholas Stambolidis' term. Mysteriously, much of our evidence dries up. Cretans produce less material to capture our attention. Almost nothing is left to show that life went on. How should we explain this puzzling downturn? Perhaps Cretans were inherently conservative, and this characteristic dominated after 600. If Cretans did not react well to change and new opportunities, we can imagine them reverting back to isolation and shutting themselves off for the rest of the Greek world. Austerity could then take over. But what I am describing are older views. Archaeological work of the past 2 decades has clarified this period from 600 to 400 and has revealed that it was not as bleak as once thought. But we still have a blurry, hazy picture of how Cretans interacted with the larger Mediterranean world in this period. That will be the focus of this talk. Here is that larger Mediterranean world and a brief introduction to the Athenian Empire. Born from conflicts with Persia in the early 5th century, the Athenians established naval supremacy in the Aegean and imposed tribute or a tax on subject states. At its core, this was an economic empire. The Roman numerals on this map refer to the geographic districts of the empire. They reveal how the Athenians themselves conceived of their empire and and its extent. With its fleet, Athens projected power beyond these limits, as the campaigns at Eurymedon and Egypt show, and I've put those on the map. Later, the Athenian expedition against Sicily tried to incorporate the Western Greeks into the imperial project. On the other side, the Levant and Egypt belonged to Persia, and Cyprus fell somewhere in between. This map also illustrates Crete's strategic importance, a bridge between East and West. And yet, the ancient sources suggest Athens took little interest in Crete, nor did any Cretan city belong to the Athenian Empire. It seems to have remained neutral in the conflicts between Athens and Persia. It also stood apart in the Peloponnesian War as fighting broke out between Athens and Sparta. A key date in the development of the Athenian Empire was the publication of tribute records, the monies collected from various cities. You get a sense of how large the inscription is when you have to climb a ladder to read it. These lists begin when the treasury was moved from Delos to Athens in 454 BC. No Cretan city appears on these tribute lists. Another reason for thinking Crete was not part of the empire. Before we take a closer look at Crete's economic position in the 5th century, it is worth taking a glance back in time to see what role overseas trade played in the Cretan economy in the century before. Years ago, the answer to this question would be negative. There was no role for trade. The end of the Orientalizing Renaissance was thought to have cut the island off from the rest of the Greek world. But we now know that a new trade route emerged and brought Crete into closer contact with the Peloponnese and North Africa. We think traders from the Peloponnese sailed down to Libya with stops in western Crete before continuing in a counterclockwise motion to arrive in Egypt, represented by the arrows. They brought with them pottery to sell from the Peloponnese, especially wine craters made in Laconia or Sparta. These craters appear at Tokra, Cyrene, and now Crates. These Peloponnesian merchants were seeking access to the rich grain markets of North Africa. Of course, pottery was not the only thing they brought with them for sale. Silver coins supplied the hard cash to purchase the grain. But pottery is the most visible part of this trade to archaeologists. Now, geography makes it virtually certain that Western Crete participated in this trade circuit. The arrows go right past Western Crete. But we now have hard evidence. Laconian craters have recently turned up at sites in Western Crete. Eleftherna is crucially important here. More than 20 of these craters came to light, more than any other Cretan site. They're just fragments, but they're very important, so I show them here. Cretan pots also made their way down to North Africa. A popular Cretan export was the water jar, or hydria, and I show some examples in the bottom left. These are the ancestors of an even more common Cretan export in the Hellenistic period, a type known as the hydria, which I'm showing there. So there's a direct line of production. Those hydria appear in Hellenistic Alexandria and were repurposed. They no longer served as water jars, they were ash urns for burials. Try to remember these water jars. They will appear again later in our story. We can conclude from this that traders from the Peloponnese stopped in Western Crete, sold some of the Laconian pottery there, and took Cretan pots on board to sell to customers down the line in North Africa. In addition, this trade relationship gives a context for an important event in Cretan history. Herodotus tells us that settlers from Aegina established a colony at Kydonia, modern Hanya, in 519 BC. Here we see Hanya from the air and showing the outlines of its Venetian plan. Ancient remains have been much harder to come by. But what we have is remarkable and confirms the tradition of settlers from Aegina. Take this tombstone dating around 500 BC. It reads, Sema Melisidos Emi, I am the monument of Melisidos. From the letter forms, we infer Aegina as the place where the inscriber learned to write. The inscription was not written in a Cretan script. So what drew people from Aegina to Crete? A compelling reason was making profit from Peloponnesian trade with North Africa. The commercial interests of Aegina are also evident in the fact that coins from Aegina circulated on Crete as standard currency. A coin hoard discovered at Matala, the place with the famous beach, contained mostly silver coins from Aegina with the turtle badge, and some of those coins are shown up in the top right. These Aeginetan turtles were the international currency of the time, equivalent to US greenback dollars are today, or once were. The standard unit coin of the system was the stater. That was their dollar, the stater. Kydonia was becoming a major port for international trade. Aeginetan merchants continued their activities on Crete well into the 5th century, the peak of the Athenian Empire. One last thing on the slide, we see a surge in pottery imports to Crete at this time. Laconian craters, but also fine pottery from Athens and other major producers. Such imports reached a peak around 500 to 480 BC. They are found not just in Western Crete, but across the whole island. Signs that trade was intensifying and the economy growing. Okay, so this highlights Aegine's role here. Oops. We now arrive at the formative period of the Athenian Empire, around 470 BC to the middle of the century. Aeginetans based at Kydonia are still going strong. And here we have a crucial step taken. Local minting of coins on Crete starts with these Aeginetans. This colony copied Aeginetan turtles, minted replicas of them, but in smaller denominations. You see that at the top left, see the turtle? Copying the Aegina type. These reveal a close relationship to the mother city. Kydonia becomes a local branch of the Aeginetan mint. Gortyn and Festos soon follow minting a shared type with a lion's head on the reverse. This may reflect a political alliance between the two neighbors. Then comes Knossos and Liktos. This is the full list for minters in the 5th century. These local coins are all full-size staters. Okay? We need to stress the importance of this development. Crete was adopting a monetary economy, something exceptional, and what one scholar has described as early as anywhere else in Europe. Crete was at the forefront, not lagging behind the rest of the Greek world. Now, early states had many reasons to mint coins. These include financing armies and navies, funding building projects, and most relevant here, coins paved the way for commercial exchanges. They made for more efficient commercial transactions. Also, states that minted coins had to assume greater authority. We must remember that ancient states were relatively weak by our standards. They had few ways of funding their activities. Taxes were low, and we'll talk about that in a minute, low taxes, but the early state did much less for its citizens. Minting is therefore a very important step in the development of state authority. Another piece of evidence here, also in this museum, shows how much progress had been made by the middle of the 5th century to create institutional structures to manage foreign trade, to manage overseas trade. What we have here is an agreement between Argos and the Peloponnese, that major player in Greek history, and two Cretan cities, Knossos and Tilissos. This inscription, top left, is from Tilissos, a site mainly of the Bronze Age. But this came from a temenos wall surrounding an altar to an unknown god, a religious building dating to the 5th century. Inscribed on the face of this wall were the provisions, and I'll quote them, "There shall be export from Knossos to Tilissos, and from Tilissos to Knossos. If a Tilician exports beyond, he shall pay the same taxes as the Cnossians. Goods from Tilissos shall be exported to wherever they wish." We are dealing here with state taxes. If inland Tilissos wanted to export its products overseas, it needed access to a port. This agreement provides them with one, a port in the territory of Knossos. One had to pay a tax to use this port. Even citizens of Knossos had to pay. Here, merchants from Tilissos received the same privilege. They paid port taxes at the same rate as citizens of Knossos. The standard harbor tax in the Greek world on exports and imports was 2%. Not much of a tariff, but enough to provide a source of revenue for ancient states. In fact, this was probably the primary source of revenue for ancient states, taxes on imports and exports. These states did not have an income tax like we do. Taxes on overseas trade were the most important source. Of course, ancient states needed the infrastructure and authority to collect these taxes. They needed to monitor borders and provide other financial services. These came with a cost, but more efficient economies enriched everyone, individuals and the state itself. This inscription, I want to emphasize, is the earliest document of its kind for early tax policies in Greece. Again, Crete was at the cutting edge of new policies promoting trade and creating an interconnected, bound Greek world. Crete was at the forefront. Surprisingly, academics have paid little attention to this fundamental document. It's been left out of the standard accounts. Apparently, old views of Cretan isolation have lingered too long in the scholarship. My third and final sign of economic growth on Crete comes in ceramic containers used to transport wine in bulk overseas. These vessels, called transport amphoras, can be traced to their places of origin based on their shape. Here we have examples from two sites in eastern Crete in the Bay of Mirabello, both from Zoria and Priniatikos Pyrgos. They came to Crete from wine producers in Ionia and northern Greece. Unlike the earlier pottery imports, the Laconian craters, for example, these are utilitarian jars involved in transporting bulk commodities. This reveals a deeper commitment to overseas trade. Imported products now had a wider impact in the everyday lives of Cretans. Each jar here contained about 25 bottles of wine, to make a modern comparison. And we have shipwrecks carrying vast quantities of these jars, wine in these containers. In fact, thousands of these jars could make up a single cargo. It's a lot of wine being moved around. What they reveal is some regions were beginning to specialize in cash crops for sale overseas. This brought greater profits, but the system depended on smooth and efficient sea transport and reliable markets. The Cretans also began importing necessities such as cooking pots with special characteristics like these from Aegina, which was the top seller in the 5th century. We might even see this as the all-clad cooking ware of its day, these Aeginetine cooking pots. Crete was on the receiving end of this new world of intensive production and specialization. We don't have evidence yet that they were packaging their wine like this early, but I'm waiting. Slight digression to say that places known to have made such wine transport jars have been plotted on this map. And from this map, we can see that Mende and Chios, and any place that receives a square or a triangle was a producer. But those places, many of them are now attested as imports to Crete. So the Cretans were drinking wine from these places that were specialized producers. And this specialized production at these places really created a new economy, a more intensive economy. And I'll just give one slide illustrating this. This is from the island of Alonissos in the northern Sporades. And what you're looking at is along the beach in a small cove, farmers would bring their wine in ephemeral sacks, and they would bring it down to the coast where it would be packaged in factories making these transport amphoras. And here we see the remnants all along the hill. It's insane. It's a mountain of broken amphoras from the production site, from the years and years in which people were bringing their wine for shipping out into the international markets. So these are the kind of sites that reveal this new world shaping up in the 5th century BC, a new world that Crete was participating in. And then, when all seems to be going well for Crete and its local economies were looking forward to overseas markets, something odd and unexpected happens. At sites across the island, the rich record of imports in the early 5th century dries up, goes away. We have a gap or interruption from 460 to 410 BC, a long period where we don't get so many imports. By now, most of these imports were from Athens, but the gap includes most other types of imports. The Athenian pot decorated in a red figure style shown here comes from Arapatra. It is a rare exception, an import within the period of the gap. So it's an exception to what I'm saying, but it shows us what we're missing at most other sites. Everything I have seen since I published an article about this gap 20 years ago has led me to conclude that the pattern holds true today, that we can't get around it. But there is a question, a very important one. Do such gaps mean a real absence, a real break in overseas connections? Or can they reflect changes, economic changes, transformations that have a less visible archaeological sign? Are these gaps real? These gaps might indicate Athenian pressure. The Athenians campaigned against Cythera twice in the 5th century, the second time during the Peloponnesian War when they established a military base there. Thucydides tells us Cythera was a commercial base for Sparta and other Peloponnesian traders. An Athenian military occupation would have disrupted Peloponnesian trade with North Africa, that route I described earlier. So maybe this had an impact on the trade that was going on. We also learn from Thucydides that Athens occasionally sent patrols to disrupt enemy shipping. But such measures must have been limited. They would not be able to explain the gap in imports on Crete for half a century. The gradual decline of Aegina as economic power must have had an impact on Crete. Athens defeated Aegina by sea in 457. Its commercial activities must have suffered after this defeat. The situation went from bad to worse when the final blow fell in 431 and Athens replaced the local population with a colony. They colonized Aegina. 2 years later, an Athenian fleet attacked Cydonia on Crete. Perhaps Athens was trying to eliminate a safe haven for Aeginetan exiles and deprive them of a base for Peloponnesian trade with North Africa. So these all would have had a bad effect on trade that Crete was conducting. One wonders how the Cretans might have reacted to such severe disruptions in their foreign trade. Did they stand by and do nothing as their economic prospects dimmed? The earliest Cretan coins offer a possible clue. What is important here is the weight standards the Cretans used. Scholars once assumed that the Cretan mints conformed to an Eginetan weight standard, the Eginetan stater. That would mean Cretans participated in an economic zone defined by Eginetan currency circulating as legal tender. But others are not so sure. Paula Perlman, my dissertation advisor long ago, has now suggested that Cretan staters weigh the same as Persian staters, that they conform to the Persian weight standard. This leads to a radical new interpretation of the economic role of Cretan coins. They seem intended for use in Near Eastern markets as traders entered the Persian Empire. That's going to lead me in a different direction, off east. Unexpected confirmation of a changing commercial outlook has come from all places from Israel, where a team of archaeologists conducting tests on pottery with banded decoration from numerous sites in the Levant. Okay, so they're working on pottery from the Levant with this banded decoration. They found something unexpected to them and to everyone else. The pottery which they tested, which has been described as East Greek and thought to be produced in Ionia and the Levant, turned out to be Cretan instead. We now know that considerable amounts of Cretan pottery were exported to the Levant in the 5th century, as early as 470 BC, the same period as Cretan coins were being minted to trade with the Levant. Some of this Cretan pottery even reached Egypt. I joined the team in publishing this evidence in 2017. As archaeological news go, this is hot off the presses. Okay. We used a variety of scientific tests to determine the Cretan origin of these pots. The shapes Cretans exported included hydrii, remember those water jars, and other jugs, some of which are shown here. In a single stroke, this new material changed the narrative of Cretan isolation and decline in a positive new direction. We can now say that Cretans did in fact intensify interactions with the Levant and Egypt in the classical period. One of the Cretan shapes exported to the Levant is the hydria or water jar we have encountered before. These were decorated with swirling bands, flower patterns, and most characteristic of all, dropped shaped tongues. Okay, so that's kind of a defining feature of them. Now remember, earlier versions of these water jars were carried as cargo to North Africa, Tokra and Cyrene. And later versions include the Hadra Hydria I discussed earlier. But they all belong to the same Cretan family. This leaves no doubt that such water jars were produced on Crete with an export market in mind all along. If Cretan coins were minted on the Persian weight standard, the transition to a new monetary system meant embracing the Eastern Mediterranean and turning away from Peloponnesian networks. Okay, they did an about face. They're disrupted over here, they move over here. Okay. Here are some possible lines of the new routes running from Crete to the Levant, and this will be part of my next book, and I'm still kind of working on this. Crete must have linked up with the island of Carpathos and then Rhodes. These were the main entry points into the Levant. Carpathos would have formed the first link, with good harbors on the south side of the island inviting stops. The city and port of Arcasia on Carpathos was ready to profit from this traffic. Its acropolis has an immense scatter of pottery on the surface that includes transport amphoras dating to the 5th century. It was linked into this new economy, okay, that was happening. This site, shown bottom right, has a spectacular position, a peninsula jutting out from the coast with 2 sandy beaches on either side. Ships stopping here could have anchored or been drawn onto either one of the beaches. Arcasia paid tribute to Athens. It was part of the Athenian Empire. And some of this money must have come from taxes on shipping. We hear of a lower tax on ships in transition who used port facilities before moving on, but didn't unload their cargoes. It's called a transit tax. And so they must have made a killing off that. The next stop en route to the Levant was Rhodes. The city of Lindos, with its famed sanctuary of Athena, was a prominent hub in international trade. Visitors came from all parts of the Eastern Mediterranean for religious and commercial reasons. It was then on to Cyprus, where Cretan pottery we know was exported. So we know Cretan materials getting to Cyprus. Cyprus presents an unusual case of unknown allegiance between Athens and Persia. We're not sure what side it was on. Athenians campaigned there in the middle of the 5th century. We also know that a famous Athenian general, Cimon, was killed in fighting on Cyprus, so it was important. But Cyprus would have been the last springboard before you got to the Levant and Egypt. I've tried to show here that a route linking Crete with the Levant is entirely possible and indeed probable. This would have been the Cretan answer to disruptions in their trade with the Peloponnese. Athens was partly responsible for these disruptions, but in the grander scheme of things, such changes are inevitable. Trade ebbs and flows according to its own rhythm. So I don't want to say I can predict everything. Okay. Now, if merchants were selling Cretan goods to the Levant, we might ask what the Cretans got back in return in this relationship. What appears on Crete from the Levant? I will give 2 examples of Eastern products or styles entering Crete along these same trade flows, only in reverse. In the last century, a deposit of sanctuary material was discovered at Alunda, another beach. It's the theme of my talk. Matala, Alunda. Okay. This was ancient Olus. This material is on display in the Agios Nikolaos Museum, and it's one of the richest collections of archaic and classical pottery and figurines from the whole island. It's worth a trip just to that museum to see this material. These were probably dedications to Demeter, goddess of fertility. What concerns us here is a special collection of clay masks or protomes depicting the goddess. These examples from Ulus on the left were either manufactured on Rhodes and imported, or closely copied Rhodian types. In fact, so closely, we can't even distinguish copies from the original. So, at Ulus, we're getting Rhodian types of figurines. A Rhodian example on the far right will let you see for yourself how close that resemblance is. See if you can tell the difference between the genuine Rhodian and the ones from Ulus. This is good evidence of direct ties between Crete and Rhodes in the 5th century. Quite good evidence. It may even express a direct connection to Lindos, where many of these Rhodian masks have been found. Okay, so that's an example of where stuff is coming back to Crete from this new trade connection. Another Cretan harbor, the port of Knossos at Amnisos, also plays a role in our story of connections with the Levant. By the Archaic period, there was a sanctuary of Zeus at the port. Remember, sanctuaries could have mixed roles, religious and commercial. Zeus received unusual dedications, a pair of large stone bird sculptures on display here in our museum. So I'm trying to encourage you to look at these. These are usually interpreted as eagles appropriate to Zeus. Eagles are his symbol. The usual interpretation has them illustrating a Cretan art conforming to mainland Greek standards of style. They look more mainland Greek. But I don't believe this. I think what we have here is an unappreciated connection with Cyprus. There is a common statue type in Cyprus depicting birds of prey, hawks or falcons, with a curved beak and long folded wings, as we see here in an example that made its way to Lindos on Rhodes. That's that Cypriot statue type. I see the amnisos birds as a later manifestation of orientalizing art, the stylistic links pointing to the Levant. A second wave of orientalizing influence in the 5th century would make sense if the trade routes flowed in that direction. So I'm offering a new twist on kind of standards in Cretan art. I think they are Levantine in inspiration. This is where I need to check time because we're getting closer to the end of my presentation. Is everyone still with me? Okay. And you can hear me all right? Am I being too dramatic? All right. I want to leave you with some perspective on Cretan political developments and the issue of austerity. So this part is an add-on. It's a special credit. No direct connection exists between trade, the economy, and austerity. So I'm not saying this is directly linked to the rest of the talk. Rather, austerity was part of the political system, and it emphatically does not equal poverty or isolation. The earliest document referring to the existence of the polis, or city-state, comes from Dreros and dates around 600 BC. I'm showing you the inscription up here. Once again, Crete was at the forefront of political developments in the Greek world. I repeat, this is the earliest reference to the city-state in the Greek world. This is where it starts, with this inscription. This was when the Orientalizing period was coming to a close, and Cretans began writing a new chapter in their history, the chapter dominated by the polis, by the city-state. State authority here asserts itself in the lives of its citizens by making laws for the community. That's what the state does. It makes rules, and it publishes them for all to see on public buildings. That's where this came from, some large public building. The social glue holding the early Cretan state together was the institution of communal dining with simple accommodations in public mess halls. This institution went by the name Andreion, and early Cretan laws refer to it as the sites shown here do. So we know about the Andreion both from literary sources and the inscriptions that are highlighted on this map from central Crete. And what we know about it is that it was a public mess hall where citizens came together in military-like austerity to dine together and forge a sense of common identity. It was the fundamental institution of the Cretan polis. A clearer picture of the Andreion has emerged recently at a site in eastern Crete called Azoria. This is becoming a very important type site, our best example of how Cretan political institutions developed in the 6th and 5th centuries. Relevant here are two public buildings, or complexes, the monumental civic building highlighted in green to the left, and the communal dining building to the right. They occupy much of the space at the top of the hill. They were enormous complexes containing kitchens, storerooms, and dining halls. The largest of these dining halls accommodated 100 or more individuals in one room, with a dozen or so other halls making space for hundreds of more diners. Probably 300-400 people could dine at once in this big complex. This is the Andreion. This is what it looked like. It was a galvanizing force. It instilled community values and a strong sense of equality among citizens. These Cretan men considered themselves equals and dined together as one cohesive unit. No one received special privileges. Ancient writers reveal that Cretan states funded the Andreion by levying a special tax. Here are my taxes again. A special tax on agricultural produce. Everyone was taxed at the same rate, 10%. It's kind of a high tax, right? 2% harbor tax, 10%? This tax reinforced the egalitarian ideals of the Andreion. Everyone paid at the same rate. And these kinds of taxes were something new and original, another Cretan innovation. They were invented on Crete, income tax on produce. Most Greek states derived their public revenue from harbor taxes and those alone, something that encouraged shipping and overseas trade. As we have seen, the Cretans also created such a tax system. Okay, we saw that just a minute ago. But what was new here is this funding of public meals through taxes on agricultural estates. The Cretan state had to expand its authority to pull all of this off. It had to become a stronger state, doing more. Zoria has also revealed how the system operated in the real world. The storerooms connected to these feasting complexes contained a large number of pithos storage jars. These allow us to calculate storage capacity. Those taxes came in not as money, but as agricultural produce. The pithos jars in one special purpose building, the West Building, because it's off to the west, could have kept 40,000 liters of produce on hand to supply meals for the public feasts. Can you imagine that? 40,000 liters? These complexes were really feasting factories on a scale larger than anything in Greece at this time or even much later. This is something new. The material from Zoria tells us much about how the Cretan state stored and processed commodities for consumption at Andreion feasts. But Zoria is less helpful for picturing the equipment diners actually used to drink their wine and eat their meals. That's one reason I undertook study of pottery from these public dining contexts from other parts of Crete. Pottery used on such occasions is found all across the island and gives a good idea of the Andreion becoming widespread in the 5th century BC. The Andreion is everywhere. The wine cups stand out from the general pottery types in their design. Their design illustrates the ideals of the Andreion. These cups are simple, sturdy, plain, and interchangeable. No cup stands out from the pack. They are standard issue and perfect for mess hall dining where every citizen was supposed to be an equal. This is the essence of Cretan austerity. It's not poverty, it's an ethos, it's an ideology. Where enough of these cups are preserved to measure capacity, something surprising came to light. By examining 2 different groups from 2 different sites, I found they were all highly standard in terms of shape and volume. They not only look alike, they hold an equivalent measure of wine. And here you see a graph that I constructed showing you the capacity in milliliters as you go up, and it shows you the range, which is actually a really tight range. And the averages are shown as single dots for each side. I think what was going on is everyone at the Andreion got an equal portion of wine. As each was contributing his fair share in taxes, that 10%, each deserved an equal portion of the meal and the wine. The average capacity of these wine cups was 900 milliliters, more than a bottle of wine. These Cretan diners were not light drinkers, but they ate and drank in a way that reinforced the ideology of citizenship and stressed the basic equality of its members. Okay, so this is my bit on austerity. I'll end the talk proper with a brief comparison with what's going on in Athens. Athenian practice in the 5th century could not be more different. There, private feasting took place at elite houses, each an exclusive group of around 10 members who came together to drink wine, tell stories, play games, and show off their sophistication. We are very far from the public mess halls of Crete. Couldn't be more different. The Athenian wine cups and other service vessels reflect their competitive values and refinements. So they really express Athenian culture well. Here we have no standardization of forms, but many different shapes serving different drinking practices. Here's a depiction of one of these parties where there are all these different cups and shapes, that they're using, because it's part of the sophistication and refinement of the Athenian symposium. Instead of austerity, we get an elaborate visual vocabulary, a world of images. These refinements reached a peak in the red figure style so well known from any museum collection of Greek vases. We don't find Cretan cups on display. They're not that interesting. We do get Athenian red figure pottery. So these two case studies, the austere Cretan pottery style and its contrast with Athens, show how far we can go in connecting artistic styles to social ideals. We should remember that the material world, the remains we see in museums, is a product of social institutions and values. It is our job as archaeologists to paint a picture of this lost world and reconstruct the social principles behind it, behind the styles such as the plain one on Crete and the fancy refinements of other times and places. I hope that this tour, through some of the material revealing overseas connections and the nature of Cretan political institutions, has helped reconstruct the lost world of the early Cretan state. That has been one of my major objectives. And to end the talk with some conclusions that I hopefully have emphasized enough, but you can ask me questions after. And by the way, before I get to these, one of the through lines, in case you hadn't noticed, is that the Cretans were at the forefront of many of these developments. They didn't lag behind, they weren't isolated, they were charting a new course for the rest of the Greek world. Many times I've had occasion to say, this is the first time we've seen this from Crete, okay? What I've hoped to show in the talk today are 4 major points. One, that states depended on taxes for their revenue and developing institutions that promoted revenue gain. And those taxes came from port taxes mainly. Okay, so they're interested in developing economic systems. States, when they emerge, have an interest in promoting trade. Number 2, the commercial takeoff for Crete, the launch, takes place in the 5th century. That seems very clear to me. There's a little bit in the 6th century, but boom, 5th century, we're now part of the integrated commercial world, a world of business financing, a world of monetary economy, a world of specialized production. This is a major turning point in Cretan history, and it's not deserved the attention. It has not gotten the attention it deserves. My third point is that this was a period, of course, of prosperity. It was also a period of austerity. They sound alike, but I want to emphasize Crete was prosperous, but at the same time, it developed austere cultural forms. Austerity does not equal poverty, okay? I want to kind of take that notion off the table. Another thing I want to focus on is these gaps in the archaeological record that we find. They often represent big change, transformative change. We just can't see it clearly at first. So what I would like to see is changing overseas relations. The Cretans moving from a Peloponnesian pattern to more of a Persian Levant pattern of trade and undergoing a dramatic shift that is otherwise lost to us except through archaeological endeavors. That's how we retrieve these momentous changes. This is not a period of isolation, it's dramatic economic change. Thank you very much.
Professor Erickson, thank you so much for this brilliant, excellent lecture. Πραγματικά ήταν μια συναρπαστική. I will go on in Greek. Μια συναρπαστική παρουσίαση με τον πιο γλαφυρό τρόπο παρουσίασε μια ανατρεπτική εικόνα της Κρήτης από αυτό που ξέραμε για τον 6ο και τον 5ο κυρίως αιώνα, που δεν θα μπορούσε κανείς να φανταστεί ότι θα λέγαμε τώρα για τον 5ο, about 5th century, that is a period of launch of economic growth and of Crete. Δεν θα μπορούσαμε να φανταστούμε ότι θα σχολιάζαμε με αυτόν τον τρόπο την οικονομική ανάπτυξη της Κρήτης τον 5ο αιώνα, που μέχρι τώρα θεωρούταν ότι περνούσε μία περίοδο παρακμής και ένδυας. Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ για αυτή την υπέροχη παρουσίαση. Αν υπάρχουν ερωτήσεις από το κοινό, παρακαλώ. Ναι.
Just taking the word austerity, right, and just thinking about the Peloponnese trade and those kind of routes, do you think that it's much to do being influenced by Spartan kind of ways of living and, you know, their culture at the time?
That's a very good question, the Spartan connection. And what's very interesting about that is we tend to think Sparta came first. It's more famous, right? I almost want to say Spartan austerity. Now, when you look at the archaeological record, Sparta becomes austere later than Crete. Sparta is austere later than Crete. We also learn that Sparta derived its laws from, guess where? Crete. The Spartans went to Lyctos to learn about how to make a better constitution for themselves. Because the archaeological evidence suggests austerity setting in around 600 BC on Crete and maybe 500 or 450 BC at Sparta, I think the influence went from Crete to Sparta, and it traveled along this trade route, the Peloponnesian-Crete connection. So I would reverse the normal order. That's not a very popular view, because you see that everyone thinks Crete is marginalized in the periods that I look at. You know, the main show is Athens, the mainland, Sparta, you know, so Crete's supposedly nothing. But that's a very, very good question, and there are a lot of similarities between their mess halls and the way it forged a militaristic warrior group. You know.
Thank you so much for this very tantalizing lecture. It was very illuminative about the period and offer new insights in a period on which we have very limited information, not only from a graphic source, etc., but also from the field. As excavators, I have just one question. Given that so much wealth was circulated around the island, as you referred in, coming from the Levant, perhaps, where is the trace in terms of architectural remains of cities, towns, public buildings, and temples in this controversial 5th century? Where are they? Because since we are excavating all over the island, we haven't met such so far, at least so far.
That's a very great question, and it's something I've wondered about my whole career. Why is Crete so poor in these remains when you go around the island? I'll mention something from Thucydides. He tells us that if Athens fell into, if we were far in the future and saw the remains of Athens, the Parthenon, the Acropolis, we would be overawed by how powerful it was. We would get the wrong impression that it was even more powerful. If we saw Sparta, which had almost nothing, we would never believe that it was powerful. And that's actually what archaeologists do today when they excavated Sparta. They're like, you were assigned Sparta? There's nothing there. And a lot of these powerful Greek states that had other things going for them just didn't invest so much in elaborate monumental architecture. I mean, the reason Athens could build the Parthenon is they established an empire where they taxed everyone and took those resources. You know, so they chose to spend their money on, you know, things that weren't really that important, you know, to other Greeks. The other factor is that because most of archaeology on Crete has focused on the Bronze Age, we've looked often in the wrong places. We've spent endless time, Knossos and, you know, and all the Bronze Age sites, and we ignored, almost neglected these important sites that we know where they are. Lyctos was one of the most important cities, and it's only recently had an excavation take place there. Only very recently. Right. Right. No, I know. So I kind of wrap that in, you know, so, you know, I think that it's the legacy of Bronze Age, but also the fact that the Cretans didn't spend their money that way. Yeah, that they didn't, unless we're missing things. But of course, you go to Gorton and you get monumental temples. You get more of a mainly Greek style of religion. So we probably don't know as much as I pretend to know about Crete. You know, we have a lot to learn. Things like, seems to me like every decade I have to rethink everything. You know, it's just such a rapidly changing field. I mean, when I started in the 1990s, there was nothing, you know, very little investigation of anything. And I can hardly keep up with all the new finds.
We seem to be talking about Crete as a unitary identity. Could it actually be that it was more than one, not culture, let's say, but more than one identity, more than one state?
More than one identity in what way?
We are talking about Crete as a unitary identity.
Okay, that question is, can we talk about one Crete, or do we have many identities? And the obvious answer is we have many. This was the land of 100 polis. You know, there are about 50 that we know existed, so the reality is still very, very large. And no doubt those each had their own customs, their own ways of doing things, so there would have been a lot of variation. And we can't get at that yet because we know so little about like the 6th century. We only have Azoria that gives us any real details. But as the field progresses, I think we will be able to say Itanos is different from this place. This has more of an overseas outlook. Chrysos has, as James Whitley probably talked about, a different kind of identity and more of an Edio-Cretan possible identity. So I think those will resolve themselves. The thing that I find important, like I learned from Paula Perlman that you shouldn't take a single Cretan constitution, that was based on Lyktos. She was very adamant that there's no uniformity. But what I've seen is the inscriptions shed a little bit of light. They show a little bit more places with the Andreion. And now pottery assemblages seem uniform throughout Crete. Those cups, they appear at every site that I've looked at. That's their standard drinking vessel. So I have to believe that there's some kind of shared common Cretan way of doing things. But I would also end by saying that those cups are used on special public feasting occasions, the Andreion. They also had symposium parties like at Athens. They just weren't as fancy, but they would have used the material in different ways. So there were overlapping identities within a site. You could put on your public face where you go to the Andreion and you paid your taxes. Then you could be at home and you could be more lavish and you could entertain your friends and put on a good dinner party. So they had different ways of acting, and it's just that we don't know enough yet. So I feel like a lot of my work is trying to establish a general model for how we should interpret new finds, to give you a global perspective on trade, and then let us look in more detail at individual sites and show the particulars of the story, which I'm sure will be different. So that's...
We had discussed about this thing, το θέμα της ομοιομορφίας στον πολιτισμό της Κρήτης, παρόλο που δεν ήταν πραγματικά ένα ενιαίο κράτος, ήταν πάρα πολλές διαφορετικές πόλεις. Νομίζω ότι ήταν στη διάλεξη του καθηγητή Παπασάβα για το ιερό της Σήμης, στη Βιάνο, όπου είχε συζητηθεί τότε ότι πιθανότατα σε τέτοιου τύπου ιερά που ήταν μακριά από πόλεις, οι εκπρόσωποι των πόλεων συναντιόνταν και εκεί πέρα γινόντουσαν οι συζητήσεις και οι ζυμώσεις αυτές, in sanctuaries that were away from cities, that people would meet and become more homogenized, let's say. Αυτό. Άλλες ερωτήσεις? Ναι, βεβαίως, κυρία Κόπα, καλό.
So, hello, I'm a prehistorian, so many links are missing from what you said. But I think austerity, also in an anthropological manner, remember of Herzfeld and all these people, this is a characteristic, a feature of a Mediterranean feature, and especially a feature of the big Mediterranean islands, and perhaps the small ones, I don't know. And Crete has this austerity diachronically in the long durée, and this is why Crete became Dorian and not Ionian. Crete has nothing to do with Athens and all this. And you had in your title the term island. The insular character matters for all these features, I think. I agree with you, but for the moment, I don't know what happens elsewhere at that time. What happens, for instance, in the rest of the Mediterranean, Central, West, and well, that's all. I think these are sparse things that you have presented, very valuable, very precious, but still the picture needs some more elaboration. it's a great starting point to review this isolation and silence. Because Crete remains silent, even down from Minoan times. It has a Dorian style anyway. And so it also is at the beginning of the Dorian world, before Sparta and before all this.
No, that's a point well taken. I mean, I think the island identity is very important for Crete, but we should also allow for a lot of regional variation. It's such a big island, it's like a continent, that different regions and micro-regions and patchwork of areas can establish their own trade relations within Crete, something I didn't talk about at all today, and they can interact in different ways. So, and I would also say that this idea of austerity, we don't know a whole lot about it because of our focus on Athens in the classical period. And like my exposure to this outside of Crete was I worked at Lerna, not on the prehistoric settlement, but on the later Greek village that was there. It's one of the first Greek villages that's actually been studied in detail. We don't usually excavate villages. And what I found there is there's a fair degree of austerity on certain occasions. They use very plain drinking party. They had different sets for their symposium. They would have a fancy Athenian set that they imported for special occasions, and they would have the local austere versions probably for different kinds of guests. So there's a lot we don't know about how the Greek world functioned from a rich archaeological perspective. And I'm reminded something that Donald Haggis always repeats when he sees me. He's like, Brice, Azoria is the best excavated site in the 6th century, period, anywhere. We don't have equivalent sites in Greece to compare it to. Nothing's been excavated like this. So in order to really start like understanding how the Greek world worked and where Crete fit within these, we'd have to really excavate at the level that we're doing now on Crete. So that's another kind of requirement for future work.
Υπάρχουν άλλες ερωτήσεις? Όχι. Καθηγητά Έριξον, ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ για την παρουσία σας σήμερα και εσάς όλους που ήσασταν εδώ.
Παρακαλώ.
Οι υπόλοιποι στο επανειδήν. Καλό σας βράδυ.